Welcome to the Entrepreneurial Musician with Andrew Hitz, a podcast from the Pedal Note Media Podcast Network featuring interviews with the best and brightest entrepreneurs and innovators in the music business. Today's episode features David Vining, college professor, author, and owner of Mountain Peak Music. David talks all about how he came to start a publishing company, why he chose a specific target audience for his company's products, and what lessons he's learned about the music business along the way. Next. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Entrepreneurial Musician. Before I introduce this episode's guest, I did want to ask that if you have been enjoying the episodes, if you could go to iTunes and give the podcast a rating, and if you had a couple of minutes to write a quick review, it would be super helpful in helping other people to discover this podcast. But if you do not have the time to do that, I say that every intro. I say we as if there's more than one person. Me and my imaginary friend. So I very much appreciate you listening. So with that botched intro, which I'm not going to edit out, we'll keep it real. I would like to introduce the guest for this episode, David Vining. How are you today, David?
I'm good, Andrew. I'm going to sound good after that intro.
Yeah, I was just about to say, this could be, the audience is like, ask him a question and stop talking quickly. So, yeah, when you're relying on a trombone player to help you out with English, that's not a good sign. So,
you're in trouble.
Yeah, exactly. So, David is known in the brass world as a fantastic player and as a fantastic teacher. But he also has a very and a publisher, and he owns a publishing company that has published countless books, and he has a really fascinating story, kind of career arc, if you will, and that is why he is on here. So, David, could you give us, for those in the audience who don't know you, could you give us kind of an overview of your career?
Sure, Andrew. I grew up in Florida and ended up at Florida State University as an undergraduate trombone performance major.
I was born and raised a Florida Gators fan because my father was the class of 1964. So there you go. So yeah,
small world.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, of course, Florida State is up the road from the University of Florida.
That it is.
So, it's in Tallahassee. Anyway, got a really fine education there and was very fortunate to get a gig right out of undergrad, which really doesn't happen too often these days. Mm-hmm. And I ended up playing in a brass quintet called the Chestnut Brass Company, and they're based in Philadelphia. The calling card of the Chestnut Brass is to play on historical brass instruments. So we had a full set of Renaissance brass instrument reproductions. We played on sackbuts and cornetos and natural instruments, natural trumpets and horns. And we also had a set of original band instruments from the 19th century, things like sax horns and over-the-shoulder horns, keyed bugles. And so we put a set of each of these on each concert. And in addition, we were quite active in commissioning. And we had a really good arranger on our tuba player, Jay Crush. Mm-hmm. And so it was really diverse to play with Chestnut Brass. I'm speaking in the past tense only because I'm not a member. They continue to this day. And so I lived in Philadelphia, playing with a Chestnut Brass for 5 years. And so that provided some professional playing experience. And that's how I managed to get into academia without having to get a doctorate. So to this day, I still don't have a doctorate, and now it's too late. So from that Chestnut Brass, I went on to get a master's degree at Bowling Green in Ohio, and went from there into college teaching. So I was the professor at the University of Kansas for several years, and then went on to the Cincinnati Conservatory, CCM, and taught there for a number of years. And now I'm at Northern Arizona University, which is in beautiful Flagstaff, Arizona. And I've been here for quite some time. I believe I was hired around 2006 or so. And just achieved full professor, so I think I'm here to stay.
Okay, congratulations.
And along the way, in 2009, I started a publishing company. It's called Mountain Peak Music. And the title actually comes from one of the landmarks around here. In Flagstaff, we have the San Francisco Peaks. And I was driving around town one day thinking about this whole idea of publishing and didn't have a name for the company, and there were the peaks. And so that's how Mountain Peak Music was born. And we publish exclusively teaching tools. So they're method books, they're textbooks, things like that. Early on in this process, I decided, for better or worse, that I was going to focus on teaching tools and not publish compositions and arrangements, because I felt, first of all, that my strengths lay in teaching methods, and also that there are plenty of publishers out there that are publishing compositions and arrangements and things like that, particularly trombone choir and things like that. So I wanted to fill a niche, a need that I felt like wasn't being covered.
Interesting. Yeah, that's something that you hear preached a whole lot by business people that either are involved in music or have absolutely nothing to do with music, is that you have to identify. You don't have to. You should identify a customer base that has a need, and not just that, but a need that that you can fill better than than anyone else. And then
Right.
then there's it's actually, as a classical musician, it's funny, we do a lot of training for something that there's not really a huge need for
Right.
necessarily. And I'm passionate about symphony orchestras, and I can, yes, contemporary music, but I can sit there and listen to Beethoven and Mozart, and I'm not in any way bashing that or straight ahead chamber music or the whatnot, but yeah, we don't necessarily identify a group of customers that are not having the needs met, and then we just kind of wonder why we're not being rewarded for the great art that we're making. So
Right. And the other issue, as far as starting this publishing business and deciding early on that I was going to serve this part of our already small community,
right.
and just publish method books, may seem like a disadvantage at first. But looking back on it, now that we've been in business some 6 or 7 years, it actually has turned in our favor, because now we are known for that.
Right.
So in a sense, it's branding.
Yes.
And early on, that was tough because nobody knew about us, and we didn't really have much of a following. But it seems to have gained a foothold, so that now authors who specialize in the sorts of subjects that we publish tend to gravitate toward my company.
Right.
Not only that, but more importantly, customers
Right.
know what we do because we're focused on that exclusively. So what started out as really quite a niche market has turned to our advantage because we do it particularly well, and that's what we do.
Yeah, you own a space of the market, and that you're now associated with that, which is that's textbook branding and textbook marketing.
Yep.
I know that I don't know who. I wish I did, because I would credit them. I don't know who came up with this idea, this concept originally. But there's the in terms of being a performer, there's the concept of 1,000 fans, and that if you can kind of cultivate 1,000 like super fans, who are people that will always go to your show, will always buy your music, will always be liking all of your social media posts and retweeting or sharing them on Facebook, are always going to be buying merchandise, etc. That you can make a living off of just 1,000 people, and then also, of course, like some less super fans, but fans, at the same time.
That's a great point. Customers are great. Repeat customers are even better.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very interesting. So let's see here. Can you talk a little bit about because I think it according to your website, it was integral in you getting into not just publishing, but exactly what you ended up publishing. Can you talk a little bit about the dystonia that you experienced in your playing? It's fascinating.
Yes. In fact, I can peg the date for you because I still have the letter from the neurologist.
Wow.
Dystonia is a movement disorder, and it comes in a lot of different forms. It can get very complicated, but we'll try not to get bogged down in the details.
Sure.
The date for me was May of 2002, and that's the letter of my official diagnosis, if that means anything. Although I should say symptoms predated that by probably 2 to 3 years. It's not one of those things you can really pinpoint exactly. So, the amount of time that dystonia sort of robbed from my career spans probably from 2000 all the way up through 2005 or so.
Wow.
Because it took me that long to recover.
Wow.
And to be clear, there's no medical treatment for dystonia.
And basically, to explain to someone that doesn't know, that in terms of you're a trombone player, how did it affect your playing?
Yeah. So the symptom for me was something it's a colloquial term that somebody coined. It's called lip lock. That's very descriptive because it's exactly what it felt like. You take a big breath in, and when you go to blow, those muscles that surround your lips they would spasm and they'd clamp down. So you couldn't really force any air out. They were very uncooperative. And the genesis of this is, of course, in the brain. It's a neurological disorder. And what happens is those neurons up there that fire together wire together.
Right.
They form these pathways. Someone with dystonia has either a fuzzy pathway or wires that are crossed or something like that, so that the signals that are sent out to the muscles so that they'll do what they're supposed to do, those signals are somehow aberrant in some way. And as I mentioned, there's no medical treatment. So oftentimes, someone who's diagnosed with dystonia, that's basically the end of their career.
Right.
And for me, I was unwilling to accept that prognosis. So I just basically retrained myself. I tried to forget everything I knew about the trombone, which arguably may not have been much. But I rebuilt myself so that I relearned how to play in new ways and rethought about how to play. And to give you an example, I grew up, learning from this book by Philip Farkas called The Art of Brass Playing.
I have it in my basement.
Yeah, many people our age at least encountered this book. And in the middle, there are these great pictures of the Chicago Symphony brass players with visualizers.
Yes.
Well, those photos are, of course, two-dimensional,
right,
and they lack movement. That's a key element of my retraining. I had to redefine embouchure to include wind and movement.
Right.
So for me, those photos no longer represented an embouchure. For me, an embouchure is three-dimensional. You can take a video of it, but you can't take a still picture. Now, this may seem inconsequential, but to a brass player, it's key.
Right.
So I had to convince myself that the wind was really the basis for forming an embouchure. And in fact, if there is no wind, there is no embouchure.
Sure.
And so it's very Arnold Jacobs sort of in its approach. Well, in answer to your question, this led to me discovering all kinds of problems with traditional teaching, particularly when it comes to breathing. There are an awful lot of misunderstandings out there, as you know.
Yes. Yeah.
And what I felt like as I was getting better was much of what I was taught, not necessarily by a specific person, just by sort of what's floating around in traditional pedagogy among brass players, it really was inaccurate. And the paradox here is by using those methods, it actually decreased my breathing and introduced tension. Now, I'm not saying the dystonia came from that, but I believe that it was a contributing factor. So that led to me writing a book called The Breathing Book, right, which is an anatomical retrospective on how breathing works. Right. It's science.
Yep. Yeah.
There are no metaphors. There's no room for interpretation. This is how we breathe. And the way the breathing book works is I present an anatomical fact, and then on the next page, you get a little musical way to embed that fact into your playing so that it actually has musical meaning to you, which to me was quite important. That way you're learning something and applying it to your playing, and you're not just learning some anatomy, which is cool, but that's not really what we want.
Sure.
So that was really the first publication by Mountain Peak Music, was the breathing book. And many of the other items are designed to either fill pedagogical holes, maybe reverse misunderstandings, or they're innovative in some way. That's our vision.
Well, I'd love to have you on as a guest of the Brass Junkies podcast so that you, me, and Lance can just talk about all of the breathing catchphrases that have been passed on from generation to generation to generation. We can just mock them all and turn everyone off. But that'll be fun. It's amazing. We all teach how we were taught, not how we actually do it. So
exactly. I'm glad to hear you say that.
Yep. So that's very interesting. So in addition to identifying a core customer base that had a need that wasn't not that no one was doing this, but that wasn't being certainly wasn't being met along, like you said, like trombone choir music. Right. You also found a space in which you were an expert, not only because of your playing and your teaching pedagogy to begin with, but then the fact that you, I don't know, you're surely not unique because none of us are, but I don't know any other brass players who are as high profile as you are that at least in my 20 plus years in the, as a professional that have had to relearn like from the absolute ground up, which that immediately gives you credibility, to within that space. Now, if the breathing book was terrible, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how, or if the layout or the whatever. How it was. Not the layout meaning physical layout, but in terms of how the book flowed, or if the methodology didn't work, or if you used big words and not, then it doesn't matter if you're, if Joe Alessi writes a crappy book, he'll sell a bunch, but he won't sell any. He won't sell any of the next book. When people are like, note to self, go hear him and not buy his book. So you were an expert in a space that you identified that had a need. So when you hear stuff like that, then it's like, well, it's no wonder that your publishing company not only made it to 2010, but is still, in 2015, the roster of authors that you have. And, how many books have you written personally?
Yeah, well, that's a good question.
A lot.
Yeah, a lot. I should point out that the breathing book is a franchise. So there are a whole series of these. And, of course, there's a trombone version. But I decided to be very specific in talking to my audience. So there's a tenor and a bass trombone book. Uh-huh. Well, of course, the content is the same. It's just some of the octaves have been displaced in the bass book. Right. Some of the verbiage might say bass trombone instead of tenor trombone. And I found that's really important to my customers.
Right.
Yeah. So, again, by actually drilling down and making your niche even more specialized, I found that my customers really appreciate that. So right. Euphonium players love having the option of buying a treble clef version. So we sell a lot of those to, not surprisingly, European customers, but it's another good example of how most publishers will just slap trombone or euphonium on the cover.
Sure.
And then expect the euphonium players to find them. Which maybe they do, but I think euphonium players actually appreciate having their own version of a book. So if you were to count all the books in that series, and then, of course, there are other editions of the breathing book. For example, we have an oboe edition, which I am not qualified to write. So I have an oboe author named Steve Kaplan who wrote that version. So it really depends on what the need is and whether or not I'm qualified. But if you were to count up all the different versions of all the series, it'd probably rank around 25 books.
Very interesting. I really like that you keep hammering home this concept of drilling down and getting more and more and more specific with your audience. As I've put out a book, and there's a couple more on the way, and starting to do a bunch of research. There's just so many options nowadays, and this is all stuff that because you live it all the time. But it's a lot easier to do trombone or euphonium than to pay someone to do two different covers, to get two different ISBN numbers, to get which every book needs, etc. And yet, if you do enough like A/B testing or whatnot, if you figure out what gets traction and what doesn't, and that's what's exciting about being a being a self-publisher, or either just me on a super small scale, or you having your own publishing company, with other authors as well, that you can figure out exactly. There's no gatekeeper anymore. You figure out what works. You figure out what doesn't work. And something else that I'm figuring out is that I think that I did not know you in 2009, but I'm guessing that you would have had a hard time convincing like a major publisher to take you on exactly the terms that you wanted to, and to do the book exactly how you wanted to do it, and to do a trombone version and a euphonium version and a treble clef euphonium version, etc. Because everyone short of like J.K. Rowling has trouble with that, I mean, and you're not quite that successful. I don't think we're going to get her on the podcast, but she's also not a musician. But I gotta stick to trombone player guests, so I'm working my way up slowly, But so and you have more credibility within the space of doing this very specific, of serving this very specific market segment than even the big music publishers do. And so you did it yourself.
Perhaps you're right. And to be fair, there was a lot of trial and error.
Sure.
As you imagine. Yeah, but one of the big advantages to starting a publishing business, there's relatively little startup cost. Not to say there's none, but
right.
Of course, in my case, there's no brick and mortar,
right,
which cuts back exponentially on your startup costs.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, there is some, but the other thing I think that helped us survive was that initially I was the primary author, which meant I had, as you pointed out, complete control over all the products, and we didn't have to pay royalties. They were all to me.
Right.
And that really helped us out from the start. The other thing that I think really boosted Mountain Peak Music was our line of textbooks. When I was hired here at Northern Arizona University, I inherited the brass methods class, which, I was at first dreading, but I came to really love this class.
Right.
I got to meet a whole different sector of students, and it was such important work that I felt like, the textbook that we inherited wasn't really doing the job. And I thought, well, we can do better than this.
Right.
Well, this was part of initiating Mountain Peak Music, was knowing that there was a market for these textbooks that were informative but still friendly.
Right.
And so what I wrote was something called Teaching Brass. And this is a hard copy book, which has the in-class playing for the students to bring to class, and they'd open their book and play out of it. However, in the front cover, there's a code, an access code. So you log on to one of our web pages, Mountain Peak Methods, and you plug in this access code, and it gives you access to all the content. So all the text is online, and since it's online, we put on videos, and PDF downloads. There are PowerPoint quizzes, all kinds of interactive. It's a very rich learning environment. So there's kind of a cool factor, if you know what I mean.
Right.
And then the other thing I discovered was it's so much easier to render some things on a video than it is in 2 dimensions, on a page. Like, how do you put a trombone together?
Right.
It's really hard to describe that. But when you look on a video, you just, I do that. I'm ready to go.
Right.
And so the students can go back to the videos and watch them over and over, and you can be very explicit about breathing and all kinds of great stuff. Well, that takes us right full circle back to the whole breathing discussion. These are future band directors.
Yes.
So if I teach them the right way, right from the beginning, out of their textbook, then we spawn future generations of really good, healthy breathers that presumably are at less of a risk to run into the trouble that I ran into.
Very interesting. How did you, were you tech savvy to begin with, or if not, how did you go about not only building a website, but building a website that includes an access code only area that has multimedia, things like that's not website 101. So how did you do that?
Yeah. This goes back to the whole there was a lot of experimentation.
Right.
And you're right. I was moderately tech savvy,
Right.
but this was slightly before things like WordPress and do-it-yourself
Sure.
drag and drop websites. So I actually hired this out.
Got it.
So the website that hosts the methods books was built by a very good programmer that I found, and turned out to be a relationship that continues to this day because I still need work,
Right.
Occasionally. And so he's a person I can count on to go back to, and he can tweak things here and there. And you're right. It's so important to get this right because no customer wants to pay for something that doesn't work.
Right.
It's probably, in my mind, been my biggest stress because I don't have control over it if something goes wrong. So I'm on top of that pretty regularly, just making sure things are going right. And I did have the wherewithal to predict future items that could be hosted by the same website. So I have a back-end sort of interface that I can go on and adjust the content and add books.
Right.
So now we have Teaching Brass, we have Teaching Woodwinds. We have another book that I really like. It's called Cross Training, and it's all housed on Mountain Peak Methods. Well, cross training is a musician's way of staying healthy. And what I did was took many of the therapies that helped me get better from Dystonia, and I put them into cross training. So the way it works is you just click on the day, and you do a few long tones, and then you do the first activity on that particular day, which on each day is a little bit of Alexander technique.
Right.
So about 5 minutes constructive rest. Then you pick up the horn and you do a little more practicing, and you come back to your activities, and you might do a Feldenkrais activity, which is another movement therapy that helped me a lot. And then there are some stretching, a little bit of yoga. It's basically a cross-pollination of movement therapies with traditional music. And that's another concept that was really important to me in getting started was taking ideas from other disciplines or instruments and, letting them intersect with either trombone playing or brass playing or music making in some sort.
So I'm guessing that you had you obviously had a positive feedback from customers with the multimedia aspects of teaching brass, or else there wouldn't be a woodwinds, and you wouldn't have used the same thing for the cross training. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. It was my beta test.
Right.
And it turned out to be very successful. So clearly there was a need.
Right.
A lot of professors must have felt the same way that I felt when I had to teach this class. So clearly we kind of struck a nerve there, and it's kind of spread throughout. And I think there are probably 50 programs using Teaching Brass. And in fact, I had no idea what the Woodwind book would do. Even though Teaching Brass was popular, I didn't know if there was the same need with Teaching Woodwinds. So I was basing Teaching Woodwinds on the popularity of Teaching Brass without knowing for sure if it would work. It's caught right on and followed right in kind. So clearly there's a need.
That's great. Have there been any products either that were not successful to the point where you discontinued them, or that were not nearly as successful as you thought they would be?
Yes.
And next question. Yeah, that's really funny. Well, without going into specifics, like what did you learn from that feedback?
Well, for me, of course, I'm a trombone player, so pretty much all the trombone players know me.
Sure.
So marketing a trombone book is a piece of cake. It kind of takes care of itself.
Of course.
And what I thought was that sort of approach would somehow manifest itself in other versions or franchises of the same title. That turned out not to be true because the common denominator really is me.
Right.
And trumpet players don't know me, at least not as well as trombone players.
That's not a bad thing.
Now that I look back on it. So, I'm thinking, I've got franchises, so I'm starting to, get all these books out there. And I discovered that it really matters who writes it. And you can't just assume, that your reputation will follow the franchise, because in my case, that has not been true necessarily. And to market a book to a group of trumpet players is a lot different than to market it to trombone players. So it's really a reinvention with each new product line or instrument that I get into. And right now we're working on making inroads in the woodwinds.
Right.
And so we have a couple of products coming up down the line. And the oboe book, the breathing book for oboe, has really been quite popular. And what that told me was there's as much a need in that area as there was in mine.
Right.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So yeah, you should never. Yeah, that's very interesting. So you never assume that what one customer base. I guess there's a couple levels there, right? A couple layers,
Yep.
because either you can't assume the same name recognition or credibility as an expert within the space, but also it might be just that those two different customer segments are value different things, get them to click on something else. So there's there's a lot of moving parts there.
Bingo. Yeah, I think the second point is absolutely true.
Right.
Yes, absolutely.
Interesting. Let's see. Were there any principles that you learned while dealing with the dystonia that you have applied to being an entrepreneur?
That's a good question. It's the hardest thing I ever did. That was to retrain.
I can only imagine.
It's not a surprising thing to hear,
right?
There's no template. There's no, there's nothing to follow. And I know of a few other musicians who have done what I've done, who have retrained. And not surprisingly, now I consult with all kinds of people who are having trouble because I've been very forthright in what happened to me. And the very first thing I tell a new person who's looking for help is, I will tell you what worked for me, but I can't promise it'll work for you.
Right.
Now, again, that seems obvious, but when you're in the moment and it's you that's having trouble, you will do almost anything to get out of trouble, because it's not necessarily just your livelihood, but there's a piece of you in this music making that's just rendered mute, basically, and it's just a horrible affliction. And so, in answer to your question, musicians are taught to think in a linear fashion. Do this, and it will lead to success with the next thing, and then you move on like a flowchart.
Right.
Retraining was not like that. I did not have success until I started mixing that up. And you might say thinking outside the box, but more importantly, it was not linear. So this idea of the cross-training, where you're putting Alexander constructive rest in the middle of practicing, is kind of a manifestation of that. Instead of thinking, okay, I'm doing a little Alexander, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that. I tried that method. It did not work. And when I started mixing things up in different ways and trying different movement therapies along with different musical therapies, well, then I started to gain a little bit of a foothold, and that's what I learned, is to think not necessarily in a linear fashion, but to create new ways of doing things that perhaps are less traditional, but might offer more effectiveness in the long run.
Very interesting.
I'd like to add one more thing to that.
Of course.
Because, I've worked with quite a lot of people who are having CHOP problems, whether it's dystonia or something like it. And I can almost always tell which category they belong in. There are two types. The first type is just so desperate, your heart aches for them, and they just need a little bit of guidance, and they're not really at the point where they can think outside the box and create their own therapy, which is really what I'm recommending. That is the person where you just try to give them a little comfort, try to guide them through the earliest steps of this process, but clearly they may or may not succeed. The second type of person is willing to take responsibility for their own rehabilitation. So they're looking for guidance, but they're not looking for specific steps. That's the person who is potentially bound for success. And that's the other thing I'd like to apply to the publishing, is to create environments where students and professionals alike can cultivate their own means of improvement. Instead of following something step by step by step, instead of doing that necessarily, mixing it up a little bit so they learn in their own way.
Very interesting. I saw a Doc Severinson masterclass at George Mason, where I teach, back in the spring, and he was talking to a student, and he was just riffing. The student played something super short for him, and he wasn't getting any slack from the student, but he did say to him, he said, like, look, kid, he said, I just dropped a nugget of gold at your feet, and I don't much care whether you take the time to pick it up or not. And that was kind of baked into the message of figure it out yourself, and just don't do exactly. And he talked about what he does, and he talked about what he's done every day, and and all of that, and the reason he can play like that at age 87, which just doesn't compute, but is because he said, I did this, and this, and he didn't say you should do that. He was very much what you just talked about, which was just kind of like, blaze your own path. And you're talking about something incredibly sweet. He was just talking about becoming an expert trumpet player, not reconstructing all of that. There's a lot of layers there. And I think that's very much true as an entrepreneur as well. You got to, if you and I at the exact same time had both tried in parallel worlds to do what you did, there's some things that I'm sure better at than you are. I can promise you there's a bunch of stuff you're better at than me, and you got to know you have to know your strengths, your weaknesses, and I know that my initial Lance and I with Pedal Note Media are kind of figuring out that we're outsourcing some stuff, and it's like my first instinct as an entrepreneur is to do it and to do it myself, and I'll learn how to do it, because if I learn how to do it, then I'll know what goes into it. I can fix problems. I'll know it's right, and if it's not right, I'm going to already know that it's not right, and et cetera. But then you start to figure out, and I started figuring this out before I had a child. So, and now that there's a child involved, it's like it's very obvious that
that's a complication, right?
Yeah, well, in time it ends up being your most precious commodity. So, I bet you could have. It sounds to me like you could have dedicated a whole lot of time and figured out how to build that membership, paywall, if you will, part of the website from scratch using code, all that. But at some point, you got to outsource, figure out what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and that's not obvious. It wasn't obvious, I should say. It wasn't obvious to me at first, because it's kind of like staying busy is not necessarily the name of the game. It's like it's being smart about it. So
yeah. I like to piggyback on that and talk a little bit about the importance of communication, because I believe it really it's related to your story about Doc, because Doc can say things in a certain way because of who he is.
Amen.
Yeah, if you and I were to try and talk like that,
to call the kid, yeah, this kid was like 21. Yeah, exactly. He would have looked at me with excuse me, you want to try that again? But you're like, yes, sir, I'm a kid. Yeah.
Right. So, this importance of the genuine voice, you being who you are, people can see that, and that's embedded in your business. So when people see a Mountain Peak Music publication, there is a certain atmosphere that surrounds it. There's a certain genuine quality, there's a certain voice, and that thread hopefully goes through all publications, but particularly my own works. So this importance of learning how to communicate both genuinely and to your audience, and to use your book as an example, it's the band director's guide. So, band directors listen with certain ears.
Yes.
So you could easily give a band director a tuba book and it wouldn't speak to them.
Right.
Right? But you've written to them. So, you could write almost the same content in a different voice and have two different books.
Sure. Yeah.
So the stuff that I do is instrument specific. There's a trombone book. There is a trumpet book. And I've done my share of state music educator conferences, enough to know that when I go there, I sell nothing. And it took me a while to realize it's because I'm not speaking their language.
Right.
These books don't say band director on the cover.
Sure.
So they're not likely to go and pick up one of each of the breathing books. It just doesn't work for them. What they need is a band version of the breathing book. So little plug.
Thank you.
That's coming down the pipe.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. You seem to always be to always have things in the pipeline. So,
my wife calls me a workaholic.
That's really funny.
Your wife do that too, I'm sure.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, the good thing, mine is just as much as I am. So, she just finished school. She's a band director here in Fairfax County. She just finished school yesterday. She has one day off today, and then tomorrow she goes and she writes a curriculum for the county. So, the problem is someone wants her present like constantly. So I kind of have that problem, but not nearly as much. So, she's much more pleasant to be around. So I'm always pleasant with a mic in my hand. So that's what you're getting. My wife actually jokes that when we first started dating that she wasn't dating me, that she was dating my representative. That's what she claims. All of the doors were held, like all the chairs were pulled out, and then like I slowly get, so that's what all of my podcast guests, you get the representative. So it's like I try and let you finish speaking. Like, I don't disagree too much. Not that I try and rubber stamp, but
I'll tell you what, next interview, I'll interview you.
Hey, perfect. There you go. Yeah.
The real.
Yeah, exactly. That'll be the end of the podcast. So, oh, that's great. Okay. So, we are, how many ideas have you had for a book that have never seen the light of day? In terms of brainstorming, like how much brainstorming do you do that doesn't end up becoming a product?
I am an enormous list maker.
Mm-hmm.
And I have an iPad with an app where I keep all my ideas.
Right.
And there are probably 100 ideas in that app right now. Because whenever I have one, it's fleeting,
Right.
So I go in there, I plug it right in.
Right.
And if and when I ever have time, I will parse through all these and put them in some sort of logical order, throw some out,
Right.
cultivate a few more. I'm big on putting things in and then letting them rest a little bit, and then coming back to them and seeing where they are and seeing if it was genuinely a good idea, and I'll do a little more work there and I'll come back to it at a different time.
Right.
So in answer to your question, there are probably 100 outstanding ideas. There are probably, I'd say, about 20 projects that are currently in production,
Wow.
either by me or a different author
Sure.
that I'm working with. And there are probably 200 or 300 that I didn't write down. that either came before I got a little more organized or I just threw out immediately. And a few that I followed through with that, people kind of discouraged me from doing that actually turned out okay. Like the Teaching Woodwinds is a really good example of that because we didn't really know. And as it turns out, it was really quite successful.
Very
At least it has been so far.
Yeah. I use, I'm a big proponent of Evernote. That's what I use to dump absolutely everything.
Yeah.
I mean, when I get a new property assessment from the county, I put it into Evernote and then throw out the paper. Anytime I get a business brainstorm, where I put the 5 questions that I'm about to ask you is into Evernote. Like absolutely everything is in Evernote. So
yeah, I like that app too.
Yep, it's good to have to have everything in one place. So, and it's so searchable. It's I've never been more organized than I have been since I started using that for everything. That what you just said, and then we'll segue into the 5 questions that we end with. That just reminded me was in terms of just dumping stuff on paper and figuring out what's good, what's not. The Lance and I, Lance Leduc, who's my business partner at Pedal Note Media, who hosts this podcast and the Brass Junkies, and we got a book coming out and a bunch of other super exciting stuff.
Do you have a publisher for that book?
We do not yet, so yeah, maybe we'll talk. We did a business model canvas, which is like a business model generation. There's a really great book called Business Model U, which is a really great thing to go through, which involves coming up with. Lance and I were teaching at the Boston Brass summer camp out in Gunnison, Colorado, and we were staying in this dorm suite, just the two of us. And it makes you come up with who your key partners are, the key activities that you're going to perform, the key resources, the value proposition, what it is that you're offering to the customers that they can't get elsewhere, the channels, like how are they going to be books? Is it going to be speaking? Is it going to be recordings? The customer relationships, the customer segments, exactly who you are marketing all of this to, the cost structure, and then the revenue streams. And you use Postit Notes, and he and I had a whole bunch of ideas, and we actually ended up having one in particular that I won't go into, but that's a really great idea. But we realized once we saw this whole thing out in front of us with these Post-it notes, and the reason you use Post-it notes is because that you kind of because you can remove them, you can move them. You realize that one that was a customer relationship actually belongs over in a customer segment, and this, that, whatever. So it's you're not erasing or crossing things out. But this one idea that we had, which was good, that it was an outlier in terms of like what our overall. So we knew we wanted to go into business together. We had an idea of what we wanted to do, but we didn't know what the heck it was going to be. And then that's when we figured out it was a digital media company was what we were going at. And then that's when we got the Pedal Note Media idea, and it just helped us to eliminate a bunch of bad ideas, to get the good ideas in a row, and kind of get our ducks in a row, so that we knew what the heck direction we were even trying to head in, rather than just the again, the practice room thing. It's like, well, if I'm practicing 4 or 5 hours a day, then it's like, then I'm busy, so therefore, like, I'm getting closer to replacing Gene Picorni in the Chicago Symphony, which, as I tell all my students, someone has to do that, so somebody's going to replace him, but there's a really great that's a plug for that book, and just that whole concept. You don't even need the book. You can just read about it on Wikipedia. There's YouTube videos, but that's a really great process for if you have even half of an entrepreneurial bone in your body, which all musicians do, I would argue. Then that can kind of help you to figure out what you want to do and what you don't want to do, and it certainly helped us, and we needed it. So we needed it big time. So. Okay, so we are now up to the 5 questions segment. Please try and contain your excitement, David. All right, the first, number 1, what is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
I was doing competition in Munich, solo competition, and one of my former teachers was a judge, and I finished, and he came up and he said, "Dave, play to the audience." I thought, what are you talking about? Well, it was a twofold meaning. The first one was I was literally pointed toward the accompanist. My bell wasn't toward the audience, so I had to move, right?
Right.
But the other thing was he was telling me to communicate a little bit, which actually doesn't apply just to playing. The whole communication aspect is really what we do, not only as musicians, but also as entrepreneurs.
Right.
So that little bit of advice has stuck with me through several parts of my career.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, the questions that I asked, a shameless plug, that I asked Joe Alessi in my interview with him for the trombone book for the band directors that's coming out hopefully within a couple of months, is not exactly the questions that I would ask him if it was just for me, but this was for the band directors. So it's exactly. Yep, example. Play to the audience. Okay, number 2, what is the biggest mistake you've ever made in your career?
When I was in the throes of this dystonia, I couldn't really play, but I still tried.
Right.
I should have just put the horn down,
Right.
at least in public and teaching when I was in the midst of this. But, it's what we do. You're
Right.
habituated to pick your horn up and demonstrate. That's what we do. And I should have just left the horn at home, and I didn't, and I regret that.
Yeah, that reminds me that Leon Fleischer, the great, the world-renowned pianist, he was, I don't remember what year it was. I think it was in the '60s that he was preparing for a competition, and that he felt a little something. It was 1964. Thank you, Wikipedia, and a fast internet connection. I remember it was 1964 that he just pushed through, and his right hand, he did not perform with his right hand again. This was like absolute top of the piano world, which is not a world that's it's a little harder to get to than the top of the trombone or tuba world, I think is a fair statement to make. And he didn't play with both hands again until, my goodness, I can't. It was 30 years later, so it was a little longer than that. It was almost 40 years later, and so it's very smart to listen. He conducted the youth orchestra I played in at Tanglewood for the summer, and that was a powerful thing, because he was an expert in that field, similar to you with the textbooks, where he just said, "Here's the mistake I made," and at that point he had yet to perform with the right hand. So that was kind of. All of us who at that age we're at Tanglewood, we know everything, and we're in high school students, but the room got quiet because he was an expert. So
all teenagers are bulletproof, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we certainly drive, especially the males. Yeah, drive that way. Number 3, what is a business or entrepreneurial book you would recommend to musical entrepreneurs?
The E-Myth Revisited by Michael Gerber, Gerber.
Great. As I was telling you before the show, that's in my queue, and I'm just about done with the book I'm about to finish. So I think that's going to be next. Yeah. Okay, number 4. What is the one entrepreneurial skill that every college music major should graduate with?
Communication. Yes. They need to learn how to stand up in front of an audience and deliver information, be it in a lecture format or a master class, whatever. That's an obvious form of communication. Ironically, we spend hour after hour cultivating our musical communication, which for some people is perfectly adequate. For the person who's going to become the new tuba player in the Chicago Symphony or what have you, again, perfectly adequate and necessary. But let's face it, for the vast majority of us, we will at some point either teach or deliver master classes, maybe even write. And I believe there's a disparity between musicians who spend all of their time in that glass bubble and the ones who can get outside of that and augment their musical skills with other forms of communication, stand a far better chance of success.
Oh, that's a great answer. Okay, and number 5, are there any assumptions that you see students make about the music business that you would ask them to challenge?
Yes, that they will never need to communicate. Again, I mentioned sort of a glass bubble. You could call it with blinders on. And I understand to a certain degree this is necessary because what we do is very competitive. And obviously you have to cultivate your skills to the highest possible level. But the misunderstanding is that when you're in school, to do anything other than that will detract from your potential of success.
Right.
That's not true.
Right.
In fact, I wish that I had gotten out of the practice room a little bit more and taken a more diverse skill set of classes. For example, marketing. I mean, who knew that I was going to do what I do now?
Sure.
But even just projecting the possibility that you could augment your music making with some other skill set would open the eyes of so many music majors. That's the preconception that I think a lot of people travel through their schooling with.
Yeah, the marketing term is, what is your point of differentiation? And by the way, I don't know why I chose Mr. Picorni. I have absolutely no inside information that he's planning on leaving, and the way that he sounds, he could stay there another 30 years before anybody thought about asking him to retire. So, but somebody, and he would agree with this quickly. I mean, he's a highly trained, one of the best musicians in the world. He's a highly trained factory worker. He is not asked to steer the ship of, he doesn't worry about the endowment. He doesn't program. He doesn't, not that there aren't committees, et cetera, but, he is paid to do one thing as well or better than anybody else in the entire world, and that's play the tuba parts for symphonies, and someone will replace him. But yeah, you never, what's your point of differentiation? It's like what else do you do is the question, and yeah, you've found your niche. A whole lot of people have. So Leon Fleischer, he made a living for 3 decades playing Ravel's left-handed piano concerto. I mean, he went around the world playing that piece, and there are a couple of others for left hand only. But he played that concerto with every single major symphony orchestra in the entire world, and so he figured out what his was, and that was actually a little bit of a selling point for him. And his artistry, in 1963, before the injury happened, needed no hook or gimmick. He was one of the greatest in the world. Right. But then that was a selling point at some point. Like, this guy can only use his left hand, and this is going to be some of the best music you've ever heard. So there was his point of differentiation, even though it was, and just like yours in a lot of ways. Is I'm not saying that you would wish to be a different person, but I'm sure that if you had never had to deal with that, then at the time you certainly would have chosen for it to go away.
Yeah, it reminds me of Maurice Andre with Brandenburg too. Mm-hmm. He was just known for the piccolo trumpet,
right,
and playing that particular piece. And you said this earlier. I'd like to revisit this idea that all musicians are or should be entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. And changing your mindset to include that as part of your personality will encourage you to learn new things and think outside the box, as we've been talking about through this whole hour.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's 20,000 people, is the stat that I heard, that graduate every single year in just the United States with some form of a music degree from college.
Yeah. That is a staggering number.
Yeah, right. And but then you start to think about it, and like the large schools have 200-300, and then it's like, well, yeah, we can get to that number pretty quickly.
Yeah, I guess so.
And if you're a young student, or not even that, if you're 25 and trying to get a foothold, and there's 20, since you graduated 4 years ago, there's been another 80,000 that have graduated, after you.
Right.
Yeah, it's a small army. I mean, if that doesn't scare you, then I'm not sure what's going to.
Yeah, and it keeps refreshing, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. It does. Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, you can't put a hold. That's not like a stock that's plummeting where they can cease trading. For the remainder of the session, and so that you can regroup overnight. Right. So. All right. So thank you so much. This was fascinating. You have a great story and a great way of communicating it. And where can people best find you?
mountainpeakmusic.com.
Okay. And do you have any new products that you're interested in plugging?
Yeah, we have a horn book that just came out by James Bolden, and it's called Solo Duet Training for Horn, where he took the top 10 public domain solos and made duets out of them, so that you get partly the solo part, but partly the accompaniment, and it trades back and forth, and it's really fun.
Oh, that's neat.
It's been quite popular.
That's actually something that I do a little bit with my students when I have the piano part, is that playing the bass part along with them and just kind of going off of the left hand a little bit in a very crude way. So that I bet if that's done well, that would be awesome.
We need a tuba book in this franchise.
Yeah, hey, there you go. If people take nothing away, you're constantly thinking. So I'm starting to sympathize with your wife. So
there you go.
I'm experiencing this firsthand. So, all right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
You've been listening to the Entrepreneurial Musician with Andrew Hitz on the Pedal Note Media Podcast Network. If you would like to help support the podcast in order to make more episodes like this one possible, please visit pedalnotemedia.com/donate for more details. You can sign up for my monthly newsletter and find my blog at andrewhitz.com. You can also find me at facebook.com/hitztuba, and I'm at Andrew Hitz on Twitter. The Entrepreneurial Musician is produced by Austin Boyer and Buddy Deschler of the Fredericksburg Brass Institute. Executive producer is Andrew Hitz. The theme music was performed by Ben Barron, Rich Kelly, Daniel Lapel, and Andrew Hitz. This has been a presentation of the Pedal Note Media Podcast Network.